So you text your friends and say, hey, I'm going to run D&D tonight. And they're all super excited. They're all on board. But one of them texted you back with a question that you didn't know the answer to. One of the players, and it was somebody who's played D&D before, said, fantastic, what campaign setting? And you looked at your phone and went, blink, blink, campaign setting. This episode is the first in a series about your campaign setting. What is a campaign setting? Why do we call it that? It's a pretty archaic term. In fact, maybe nowadays they call it just the setting or the world that your D&D game takes place in. But I call it a campaign setting because that's what they called it back in the 70s and the 80s. And they called it a campaign setting because they had played a lot of war games set during the Napoleonic Age. And they called a campaign a collection of battles. So you would sign up for the army and you'd go on a series of tours of duty. Each one was like an adventure. And when you strung them all together, that was called a campaign. So that's what a campaign is. A campaign is a collection of adventures. Now, the setting for your game is this interesting phenomenon where you can play D&D without one. But even if you play without one, by definition, your game takes place in a world. Back in 1974, 1975, when the game first came out, when everyone was playing it, they were playing in a kind of collective shared world. There weren't a lot of details. They were making everything up as they went. One way of describing that default setting they played in back in the early 70s is Fantasyland. Fantasyland is the kind of medieval, Tolkien-esque, Western European setting that we all kind of take for granted. You don't need to know anything else about the setting. If you're playing D&D and you come to a town, you expect that in this town there's going to be a blacksmith, there's going to be stables for horses, there's going to be an inn for people to stay at, there might be a priest for you to buy potions from, there might be a wizard for you to buy scrolls from. These things are all built into the idea of Fantasyland, even without a campaign setting. So not only can you run D&D without a setting, people did it for the first 2 years of the game's existence until the Greyhawk supplement came out. Now you can go out and you can buy a prepackaged campaign setting, and the advantage of that is it's all done for you. Someone else has already made all the maps and figured out where all the countries are and come up with all the names for everything. And I have run a campaign setting. In fact, one of the best games I ever ran, we played every week for 3 years in the Birthright campaign setting. It was my favorite D&D setting that they published. But since then, I've tended to roll my own. I make my own campaign setting, and I'm encouraging you to do the same thing. Again, there isn't a right answer to any of this stuff. Making your own campaign setting, going and buying a campaign setting, there are good reasons for doing both. But back in the 70s and the 80s, when you were done playing D&D and you went home, you didn't play Minecraft or League of Legends or Rocket League. You had nothing else to do. There was no internet. So often, those of us who were players, the reason we wanted to DM was because it was fun to make a world, and that was the thing we did between sessions. If you've looked at any of the stuff Tolkien did for Middle-earth, you can see you can get super noodly, and different people engage with campaign settings in different ways. Some people like making lots of maps. Some people like making alphabets. Some people like building elaborate pantheons of gods. Some people like building the history. If you've ever seen Dwarf Fortress, one of the things that game does before you ever play is it generates this 1,000-year history of everything that's happened before you showed up. These days, a lot of things compete for your time. That's one of the reasons I think prepackaged campaign settings have kind of taken over. But I'm here to tell you, making your own campaign setting is fun, and it's not as tough as it might seem. One of the reasons building a campaign setting from scratch is fun is it gives you the opportunity to make D&D work the way you want it to. You know, the guys who designed D&D, they were people just like you. They had their own ideas of what the different races should be. Maybe you have different ideas. Yours are just as valid as theirs. Now, in my setting, what I tend to do is I make sure that everything that's in the player's handbook is in my setting. But I tweak some of the things so that they're different and I hope a little bit more exciting and interesting than the stuff people are used to. I say that, but really it's just because I have my own ideas about how some of these things should work, and I think they're neat. It's a mistake to think of them as somehow better. They're not better, they're just mine. For instance, in my setting, Dragonborn are not like a biological species with a civilization. They are something that are made by wizards. Kind of like half-orcs from The Lord of the Rings. And I tell people when they're making characters in my game that being Dragonborn is illegal in my setting. And they say, whoa, you mean I can't play one? I'm like, no, you can play one. But if people see you, they may sell you out to a local bounty hunter and they'll come and try to collect the bounty on you. Because in my setting, the Dragonborn were the knights of Good King Omund. And the guy who usurped him, the invincible overlord, declared the Dragon Knights illegal. And you can see how I took the kind of somewhat generic notion of a dragon man from D&D, and I made it specific to my campaign setting. I gave them a specific past and a history and also some great plot hooks. A lot of great adventures have started because players in my game have made Dragonborn characters. So it's not unusual for my players when they play a Dragonborn to wear a hood over their face to try to obscure their features. And then after they've done a couple of adventures and the people in town trust them, they go openly and they're like, yeah, I'm a Dragonborn, and the people love them because they're the heroes. But then they go to the inn one day and there are some bounty hunters in the inn and they see a Dragonborn guy there and they go, hey, and they just get up and try to leave. And right there's some tension. If the players don't realize what's going on because maybe they've forgotten that it's illegal to be Dragonborn, the other people in the inn, the NPCs that are there, will stand up and try to stop the bounty hunters. Because at this point, the people in town are like, hey, this guy's on our side, he's a good guy. And all of a sudden there's a combat in the middle of the inn. So that's just one example of how you can take the stuff in the player's handbook, the different races, and even stuff like spells and gods, and make them yours, tweak them, change them, not because you thought they're bad, but because you have your own ideas. It can seem daunting to build your own world from scratch, because even saying it the way I did makes it sound like a lot of work. I'm building an entire world? Well, no, you don't need to build an entire world. The simplest way to build your own campaign setting from scratch is to start with a town. You start with a town, and then you build out to the local area, and then eventually you zoom out to the entire campaign setting, and over the course of weeks and months and years, you have an elaborate world that you've built from scratch. But to get started, all you need is a town. Now, like building an adventure from scratch, you can make a town from scratch, and there are tools online for you to do that. In fact, there are random town generators. But I don't do any of that stuff. In fact, I almost never make my own adventures from scratch. I usually buy something that somebody else wrote and somebody else published, and I make it my own. Why a town and not a city? That's a good question. Well, a city is a big, sprawling place where adventure happens. And I've started campaigns in a city. In fact, there are some classic city supplements expressly for this. But running a campaign in a city can have the same kind of problems that buying a prepackaged campaign setting does, which is all of a sudden, either if you're making it yourself, you have a lot of work to do, or if you're buying one prepackaged, you've got a lot of reading to do. Whereas if you start in a town, it's a small, manageable chunk of content. You can buy one online, read it in an hour or two, and know everything there is to know. If you make a town from scratch, it takes you an hour or two, and at the end of that process, you know everything there is to know about that town. You are the expert. And it feels great when the players show up to the town and you know everything in that town. You feel confident. You feel like you're ready to run D&D. If you're starting at first level, starting in a town is a good idea because it is a small, contained chunk of content and it has just the right amount of things for the players to do. You can expect that there's a wizard in a small town, but not a powerful wizard. Just powerful enough to maybe identify items and make scrolls. There's a priest in town at the local church, and he's powerful enough to sell potions and maybe cure disease, but he's not powerful enough to raise the dead. So you've presented the players with some solutions to their problems, but not every solution to their problem. Also, if you have a town with a high-level NPC and like a 9th-level wizard, the players will start wondering, why are we going on these adventures instead of her? Now, if you go buy the D&D starter set, you get this thing, which is an adventure, and it comes with a town. It comes with the town of Phandalin. And Phandalin is a great starting town. I recommend you use it. It's got, I think, just the right level of detail. It has a map of the town, it tells you what NPCs are in the town, it tells you what goods and services you can get, and there are lots of cool little plot hooks in there, and if you have your own adventure, or if you've gone and bought another adventure online, it's very easy to kind of hook them up in Phandalin. Now, Phandalin is set in the Forgotten Realms, and it has its own geography, and it's got its own nations, and it's got its own deities, so if you take it and make it yours, then you're going to have to change all that stuff. For instance, Phandalin is not that far from Waterdeep, which is the biggest city in the realms, and you might have your own idea for what the big city nearby should be. Maybe it's not called Waterdeep. What do you think a cool, romantic-sounding name for a big city would be? Also, it's got the Forgotten Realms deities, and you may want to make your own deities. Now, that alone can be a lot of work. Creating an entire pantheon from scratch can take a lot of time. I don't think you have to do that. You start by saying, okay, do I have a cleric player or a paladin player? Who is their god? Ask them what kind of cleric they're going to make. Ask them what kind of paladin they're going to play, and make a god for that character. Then, in the town, make sure there's a temple with a priest from a different god. That way, you've only had to come up with 1 or 2 or maybe 3 gods, but now the players have a feeling that there is a wider world out there, or there are lots of gods, presumably. That's a big part of the DM's job, is just creating enough content to give the players the sensation that there's a larger world out there without actually having to build the larger world. Now, I've been playing the game since well before the starter set came out, so I don't use Phandalin. I have my own 3 little towns that I use, depending on which group I'm running. The towns I use are Hommlet, Orlane, and Milburn. Each one of them is from a different TSR product from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, respectively, I think. A lot of people think Hamlet is the ideal starting town. It's from an adventure that came out in 1979 called The Village of Hommlet. And it was designed to be the first in a series called The Temple of Elemental Evil. And eventually, like 6 years later, The Temple of Elemental Evil came out, and it's this huge, sprawling dungeon that I think is largely unplayable. It's super famous, but I don't think you can just read it and figure it out. We'll talk about big adventures like that in another episode, but Hamlet is a lot of fun because you get a lot of detail. There's a map of Hamlet, and there's a list of every major NPC in the town, who the blacksmith is, who the carpenter is, there's an inn. And you can tell that Hamlet is kind of old school compared to Phandalin from the starter set, because in Hamlet, there is a listing not only of every NPC, but how much gold they have and where their treasure is hidden. Because there was this expectation back in the day that a thief player might walk through town and see these local yokels and go, hey, I wonder if I can steal that guy's gold, or copper pieces, or however little money they had. So that's something they don't do anymore. They don't list all the NPCs in a town with all the money they have and where they hide it. But the Village of Hommlet is great because you do get a list of NPCs, and some of them are relatively high level, like 4th or 5th level, and that makes them high enough level that they can help out the players if the players get in a jam. But we'll talk about that in another episode, the idea of having high level PCs around that are available to the players. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. There are reasons to do it and there are reasons to avoid it. Once again, there's not a right answer to a lot of these things. So Hommlet is a great little starting town, and nearby Hommlet is the Moat House, which is this kind of fortress in the middle of a swamp. And there is a great classic starting dungeon, the Moat House. I think it really is legitimately one of the best starting dungeons. But it's not much of an adventure, if that makes any sense. It's just this thing that's sitting out there. Everyone in town knows about the Moat House, and they know there's something going on there. And there are some mid-level PCs in town, so why don't they go do it? There's not really an answer. There's not really any one hook in the Village of Hommlet that leads you to the Moat House. It's an old school adventure, and they just assumed that if you heard about this dungeon in the middle of a swamp, you would want to go there. Phandalin is much better when it comes to giving the players interesting hooks to get them from the town to the adventure. One of the other towns I use, Orlane, is from this classic adventure. It's my favorite starting adventure, and it's one that I strongly recommend if you're interested in it. It's called Against the Cult of the Reptile God. I love Against the Cult of the Reptile Gods because not only do you get this town, Orlane, which, like Hommlet, is a nice fleshed out town, but there's already something going on in Orlane when the players show up. When the players arrive in Orlane, they discover that some of the townsfolk are behaving very strangely. Other townsfolk think the town is cursed, and there are many boarded up shops because people have left. That's how convinced they are that there's something terrible happening. And then it becomes up to the players to unravel this mystery. What is going on in town? I think that's a great plot hook, and in fact, I used it when one of my players said that he thought it would be a cool idea if he had a sister. His character's background was hermit, so he's off in the hills doing research in some ruins, and all of a sudden he gets some notes from his sister. I had written out all of these notes, and she had been writing them over the course of weeks and months, but he got them all at once because that's how the mail works in a medieval society. This dwarf just shows up with a package of letters and says, "Hey, it took a long time to find you, sorry." So my friend Tom reads these letters and he discovers something very strange is happening in the town of Orlane. And I put those letters in the doobly-doo. You can download them. I made sure it was a Word doc so you can edit the names yourself if you want. The player was really impressed that I had created all this stuff for him, and he felt deeply invested in what was happening. As soon as he got to the last letter where something obviously bad had happened to his sister, he wanted very badly to find out what was happening in Orlane. Now, I'm not going to tell you what was going on in Orlane. I'll put a link to all these adventures in the doobly-doo down below, and you can check them out for yourself. But just be aware that the old school adventures tend to have a different attitude toward descriptive text. Basically, they're harder to read than modern stuff. They go into a lot of detail that a modern adventure wouldn't go into, like, for instance, where everyone keeps their gold, and they lack certain details that you would expect, like what are the plot hooks. That's why I think Against the Cult of the Reptile God is fantastic, because it is a town with a built-in plot hook. And the Reptile God you have to fight at the end of it is awesome. My Thursday night group, on the other hand, started off in the town of Millburn. They're still there. Millburn is the starting town for the epic adventure Night Below. Night Below came out in the 90s and is a much more modern adventure. Super readable, by the way. Although, unfortunately, it's kind of a pain in the ass to find. There is no PDF of it online. You can get it on eBay for about $60. I still have my original copy from the 90s, but unfortunately it's missing all the player handouts, because I handed them out. So now I had to go buy another copy off eBay for my new players. I think Millburn is great because unlike Hommlet from the Village of Hommlet and unlike Orlane from Against the Cult of the Reptile God, Millburn is the center of an open world sandbox game where there is tons of low-level content around, some of which links to the big meta plot of the adventure, some of which doesn't. And it's up to the players to decide how to engage with this content. For me, the sandbox game is the thing D&D does best, so it's the game I tend to run, but I also like games that are on rails. Again, there's not one right answer to these things. So we talked about Hommlet from the Village of Hommlet, we talked about Orlane from Against the Cult of the Reptile God, we talked about Millburn from Night Below, and we talked about Phandalin from the D&D starter set. All of those are great starting towns, and they're all you need to get started with your campaign setting. Even though we did a whole episode where we made an adventure, I'm basically going to advocate for you buying other people's content and then making it yours, because in my experience, that is the easiest road to lots of content that is customized. Of course, you can do it all from scratch. I know lots of players who do that, and I have a huge respect for people who do that. I'm just a busy person. I have stuff to do. I'm running 2 games of D&D for one thing. Next episode, we'll talk about dead ends. What happens when your players run into a plot point and they are unable to progress beyond it? As you can imagine, there's not one right answer. See you next time. Peace out.